Good morning, Freedom Middle School. This is Mr. Swartz. Today we are going to be learning about the judicial branch, which is the court systems of the United States. So let's get started. Before you start going through this presentation, you'll be wanting to take notes. Today in class, I gave you this organizer, so you'll be filling this in as we go along. We'll start with this vocabulary, and then we'll go through some of these other organizers. So put your name on the top and be ready to write. So like I said, we're going to be talking about the court system today, which is part of the judicial branch. This actually is the U.S. District Courthouse in downtown Orlando, right near the Amway Arena. All right, here is our vocabulary. A few important words that we're going to need to know as we go through today's presentation. First, we have precedent, a standard or rule established by a court case that is an example for other cases. You should see a space on your paper where it says precedent. Just write in the definition next to it. Next, counsel. That means a legal assistance or advice from a lawyer or an attorney. So when we're talking about court cases, you might hear any of these three words: attorney, lawyer, or counsel, all to describe the person who is helping you in court and is representing you in court and speaking to the judge and the jury for you while you're on trial. Next is an appeal. If you were on trial, you lost the trial and you feel it was unfair or there was a mistake, you can appeal, and what that means is it goes to the next level of courts, and some other judges may take a look at it. They may review the case and find that it was unfair or a mistake was made, and they can overturn the case, meaning they can correct it or reject what the lower court said. All right, here we have the structure of this U.S. Supreme Court, and you should have a chart that looks just like this, except for blank, on your paper. You notice we have a few different kinds of courts. There are two main systems of courts. There's the U.S. federal courts, courts that are by the U.S. federal government, they're for the whole country, and then there's state courts, which each state would have its own courts. There's also some other special courts we'll talk about just really briefly, but mostly we'll be focusing on these two kinds of courts. So, if you were to break a federal law, which hopefully none of you will ever do, but just if someone did, their case would start out at the lowest level of the U.S. federal courts. There's 94 district courts, including that one in Orlando that I showed you at the beginning. If you lost your case, you felt that it was wrong, it was unfair, you could appeal. And it makes a lot of sense. If you appeal, you go to a court of appeal. Those can also be called circuit courts because there's 13 circuit courts around the country. There, you would have a panel of 3 judges who would look at your case again. If they go against you again and you still want to appeal, then the highest court in the United States, the highest appeal court, is the U.S. Supreme Court. If they listen to your case, they hear it, whatever their decision is the final decision. Now, most of the time, though, the court you would end up in would be a state court, because if someone broke a local or state law and the crime happened entirely in one state, it's going to end up in the state courts. It's not going to have to go to the federal courts. So that there you would start out in a local court, like Orange County Court, for example. Same thing. If you lose that case and you want to appeal, it would go to a state appeals court. Finally, and if you lose again, you could appeal to the highest state court of appeals, which in the case of Florida is the Florida State Supreme Court in Tallahassee. And above that state Supreme Court, there is still the U.S. Supreme Court. No matter what, the U.S. Supreme Court is the highest appeals court in the country. So that is the final destination. Whatever they would say is the final decision. And we'll notice there are these side courts here, but those are really specific, like a court of international trade, talking about business between the U.S. and other countries, or a court of military appeals, specifically for people in the military. So we're not going to really talk about these because they only are relevant in those particular cases. Alright, so we're going to keep on moving. If you need a pause to write all this down, you can do that. Just make sure you know these diagrams, and especially remember that there are two main systems of courts. There's the federal courts, the courts of the government for the whole country, and then each state also has their own courts. Okay, moving along, we're going to go to types of law. You should have a little organizer, a little space like this with the types of law. So across the top, you write the name of each type, so criminal, civil, and constitutional law. Here you'll have room for the description of each, and then there's also examples of each. So let's look at the types of law. First we have criminal law. That's where a person breaks the law. It could be local, state, or federal. And the trial is to decide guilt and punishment. So examples would be speeding, theft, murder, anything where you're breaking the law. So in those cases, it would be the government is trying to prove that someone committed the crime and should be punished. So it's the government versus a citizen in criminal law because the citizen is accused of breaking the law. In civil law, it might not be that anyone necessarily broke the law. It's more a dispute or an argument between two citizens, or maybe between a citizen and a company. That would be things like divorce or injury lawsuits. So all those commercials you hear on the radio or see on TV, Morgan & Morgan, for the people, 1-800-411-PAIN, all those kind of things. That is talking about civil law, where maybe someone crashed into your car, so you're going to sue them to make them pay to fix your car. Or you're at the hospital and you think the doctors made a mistake, so you think you should sue them because of the mistake they made. Or there's a divorce and the people who were married are now having to sort out things like finances and the house and even custody of children. So in civil law, it's not necessarily that one side broke the law, but the law has to get involved to sort out the argument, to decide who gets what, or if anything's owed in a case where someone is suing another person. Finally, there's constitutional law. That's where citizens feel that their rights that are in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, no cruel and unusual punishment. If citizens feel like they've had those rights violated by the government or by another group of citizens, they can go to court and to get their rights reinstated. So here's an example. We've seen this picture before, but that's the Tinker case, showing that students have freedom of speech. That's a constitutional law case. The students were demanding their freedom of speech. All right, next we're going to learn about some Supreme Court cases. So here we have the 9 justices of the Supreme Court, the building of the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. And this is a picture showing the effects of one court case we're going to learn about. We're going to find out that court cases don't just affect the one person or the few people involved in the case. It can affect the whole country. As we will see in a little bit, one court case affected the schools for the whole country and who gets to go to which school. All right, we're going to start out with Marbury versus Madison. There is a whole complicated backstory to this. They talked about it in the video we watched the other day. The main thing to know is that in this court case, they established judicial review. This term judicial review, means that the Supreme Court has the power to look at a law, and they can decide if that law agrees with the Constitution. If they look at a law and say, man, this law is messed up, it's taking away people's freedom of speech, or it's punishing people in a cruel and unusual way, it is against the Constitution, they can say it's unconstitutional and they erase that law as if that law never happened. So all these notes about the Supreme Court cases, you're taking these on actually the back side where you have these sections. So you'd write the details of the case, like that I just described in here. You'd say the name of the case, so like here you would put Marbury v. Madison, and the year would just be the year of the case. So in this case, if we look back up here, it's 1803, so we would put 1803 as the year, and then the details go right in here. All right, so let's get back to it. Moving along, Plessy versus Ferguson. This is often called the worst Supreme Court decision ever. You find out Supreme Court can actually make some pretty big mistakes because the people on the court, they're humans too. In Plessy versus Ferguson, they this established segregation, separation of Americans based on race. This court decision said that states had the right to decide if they would have separate but equal facilities, meaning like a bathroom for African Americans and a bathroom for white people, restaurants, places on the train for each of those. In this case, this man Plessy, African American, got into a white train car, was arrested for it. He sued, and in a pretty messed up decision, the court went against him, saying that states could do that. So the court got it really wrong. However, 50 years later, that mistake started to be corrected. The court actually changed its decision. By that point, all the people who had been on the court before were dead. There's different people on the court now. And they, in Brown versus Board of Education, said that segregation could not happen in schools, that African American students should be going to the same schools as white students, and that separate but equal wasn't actually happening, that by separating the schools, one group was actually getting a better education than the other, and so that had to stop, and students had to go to the same schools. So this ended Plessy versus Ferguson. It said segregation needed to end in public schools. All right, Gideon versus Wainwright. This is this guy Gideon. He was arrested. He was sent to jail, and he said that he was unfairly sent to jail because he didn't have a lawyer to help him through the trial, a counsel to help him through the trial. So what this case decided is that if you can't afford a lawyer, the government should help you by providing you with one. So there's this thing called a public defender, a lawyer who will help you out, and you don't have to pay for that lawyer if you can't afford it. In Miranda versus Arizona, this lets you know that the police have to tell you what your rights are before they question you. So you have the right to remain silent. Okay, so you don't have to talk to the police if you don't want to, or you can wait till you have a lawyer with you to help give you advice as you talk to the police. But if you do decide to say something, anything that you say can be used against you. So if you say, yep, I did it, I robbed that bank, they're going to use that against you. Right, so here we have that shown right here, Miranda versus Arizona, a little cartoon to go with that. They used my confession against me. I totally didn't see that coming. So if you talk to the police and give them information, they're probably going to use that against you. So this is saying you don't have to talk to the police until you have a lawyer with you to help you. You can remain silent until that point. All right, Tinker versus Des Moines. Students have First Amendment rights to free speech as long as they do not disrupt school. If you remember that we talked about this case in the DBQ a while back. So these students, they were wearing these armbands as a protest, and the court says that was okay as long as they weren't causing a disruption to school. They can share their opinions. Now, a little bit later in Hazelwood versus Kohlmeyer, the court kind of went against that a little bit. They decided that censoring the school newspaper does not violate free speech, meaning the school newspaper can make rules about what students put in their newspaper or on the morning announcements, for example. The court said because that's part of classwork, as assignment for class, the school can decide what's appropriate for those assignments. So students weren't free to say whatever they want in this case, if it's in a school newspaper, announcements, things like that. Getting near the end here, Nixon versus the United States. Even the president has to obey the law. President Nixon had committed some crimes. He had sent some people who worked for him to break into the Democratic Party's offices. But he thought he didn't have to be punished for that, and that the information, the evidence against him shouldn't become public because it should be secret since he was the president. Now they said the court decided only in cases of national security, only when the country is in danger, does the president get to keep information secret that way. So even the president has to obey the law. Finally, in Bush versus Gore, this was a crazy situation. It was a very, very close election, and they had to recount the votes because there were some mistakes in the voting, and it went on and on for weeks. So no one knew who was going to be president. Finally, the Supreme Court stepped in and said the counting had to stop. Whoever had the most votes at that point would be the winner for Florida. By just a very small amount of votes, George Bush had more votes, so he was announced the winner in Florida, making him president of the United States. That's the end of our presentation. We're going to keep learning about the courts tomorrow. Have a good day.